Hello. I think we're live. I think everything is working. Man, this is a complicated setup. All right.
So the first thing we're going to do.
Cut here. Let's make sure everything's good. Hey everyone, I think we're live. I can't tell though if you can hear me. So as soon as the screen changes here, can someone in the chat please let me know if you can hear me? That would be great. Okay, that's a good sign. I'm hearing things. All right, awesome. We're live. Okay, so if you're new to this, the way that this is going to work is every week at Monday, we stream John Vervaeke's lecture series called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. Today we're on episode three. That's right.
And so in 1 hour, we're going to have the discussion. So you guys can watch along with the video, and then the discussion is 1 hour later.
Yeah, that's right. So this week we did something different, right? We're not everyone can join the discussion.
Yeah, it's by invitation.
Okay, cool. Mm-hmm. So for anyone who's already in the waiting room for the discussion, just know that I will let you all in when it's discussion time, but you can just chill there if you want. Right.
Should we start the video?
Yeah, I think we're good to go here.
Let's
so
watch.
Please, if anyone, if there's any problems, please let me know in the chat. I'm watching the chat the whole time. So I will be, by the way, I'll be discussing with you guys in the chat, and Yuvi's going to be doing the show notes, and you can check the show notes out at futurethinkers.org/meaningcrisisnotes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I took a ton of notes.
I think we're good to go here. Righty then.
Welcome back to Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. This is our third time together. Last time we were talking about more what was going on in shamanism and the Upper Paleolithic transition. We talked a lot about the flow experience and how it integrates altered states of consciousness, something like, or at least on a continuum with mystical experiences and meaning making. Enhanced insight and intuition, and how this resulted in an enhanced capacity for metaphorical cognition, which greatly expands human cognition, makes it much more creative, much more capable of generating all of those fantastic connections in meaning that drove the Upper Paleolithic transition's explosion in culture and technology. And then we moved to consider some other intervening revolutions that also had an impact. We talked briefly about the Neolithic Revolution and the beginning of agriculture and then the rise of civilizations. We got into the Bronze Age civilization, and then that led us into the revolution we're concentrating on now, which is the axial revolution, a period around between 800 BCE and 300 BCE following the Bronze Age collapse. The Bronze Age collapse, if you remember, was one of the greatest, if not the greatest collapse in civilization the world has ever seen. And that facilitated much more experimentation in smaller scale societies. And that experimentation resulted in the creation of new psychotechnologies. One was alphabetic literacy, happening in the area of Canaan, and it's eventually going to be taken up very quickly by the Hebrews, and then taken up by the Phoenicians and taken to the Greeks. The Greeks, as we'll see today, or at least today or next time, further improved it. We talked about how that psychotechnology, alphabetic literacy, makes literacy more effective, more efficiently learned, more powerful in its operation, greatly expands the number of people that can be literate, enhances the distributed cognition, and how that psychotechnology gets internalized into our metacognition and produces second-order thought. We get an enhanced awareness of our own cognition, both its power and its peril, We get an enhanced awareness of its capacity for self-correction and self-transcendence, but we also get an enhanced awareness of its capacity for self-deception. We talked also about the invention of coinage to help deal with the mobile armies of this time, and how that trains you in abstract symbolic thought and more rigorous mathematical reasoning. And that also gets internalized, it gets exapted, right, into second order thinking, and people start to become aware of themselves in a different way. They start to become much more aware of the meaning-making nature of their cognition, its capacity to generate illusion and self-deception, and also its capacity to break out of illusion and self-deception and to come into a contact with a more real world. So this leads to some fundamental changes. People start to become more aware of their responsibility for the violence and the chaos and the suffering in their own lives. And they start to become aware of how much the transformation of mind, or mind and heart, because in the axial age these terms are often referred to in a singular manner, how much transformation in the mind and heart is the way to alleviate suffering. So what starts to happen is the mythological framework and the way people are framing themselves and their world changes. Now let me explain to you how I'm using this word myth, because I'm not using it the way we standardly use it. The use I'm going to talk about has been deeply influenced by people like Jung, people like Tillich, Victor Turner, just a whole bunch of different thinkers. So when we use the word myth, we tend to mean a falsehood that is widely believed. Okay? That's unfortunate because we've lost the term for what I want to talk about. See, myths aren't false stories about the ancient past. They're symbolic stories about perennial patterns that are always with us. That's a very different thing. So a lot of what's going on in myth is an attempt to take these intuitive, implicitly learned patterns and put them into some form that is shareable with ourselves and with each other. So in the Bronze Age world, before the axial revolution, people experienced the world in what's been called by Charles Taylor like the continuous cosmos. Well, I have a few questions about the use of the word cosmos, but we'll come back to that later. The idea here is human beings experience themselves in radical continuity, that sense of connectedness, right, that you see even back in the shamanic world, was very prevalent in the continuous cosmos. In the continuous cosmos, people feel there's a deep connection, a deep continuity between the natural world and the cultural world, and between the cultural world and the world of the gods. So the differences, right, are not really differences so much in kind as they are in power. It's not odd that animals might talk, right, or they might have sort of deep societies. It's not odd for us, for certain human individuals, to think themselves divine. Like the greatest axial age, the greatest pre-axial age empire is Egypt, and the pharaoh is a god king. He's something like a god. Why? For us, we can only understand that at most metaphorically. Here's what you have to try and understand. It's not a metaphor for the ancient Egyptians. Right? Why? Because the differences between, right, human beings and the gods are differences in power. This is a cosmos that is experienced, where reality is experienced primarily in power, in terms of power. The gods are just more powerful than us, more glorious than us. You can even see this in the Old Testament, right? Where if you ask people, you can ask people, what term is most often used of God? And people will say, righteous or holy. Well, those are used quite often, but the term that's most used is glorious, shining with power. Right? Which it's not a moral term at all. Think of the Greek gods. They're not moral exemplars at all. They're just extremely glorious and extremely powerful. The Egyptian king, the pharaoh, is extremely glorious and extremely powerful. So of course he's godlike or potentially even a god. So there's this continuous cosmos. And it's continuous in another way, right? It moves like this. It moves in great cycles. Just like the seasons, just like day and night. Time moves in large cycles that repeat through eternity. In fact, what you're often trying to do with your ritual behavior is you're trying to tap into this continuity. You're trying to get back to the original power of creation. So you often enact the metaphorical story, the myth of how the universe is created in order to try and tap into that creative power. There's a constant nostalgia for getting back, right? And your attitude towards the world is you want to fit into these cycles. You want to be in harmony with them. You don't want to really change things a lot, because if I change this, if I change my future, I'm actually undermining my past. It's a very different way of relating to the world. So there's this continuity between the natural world, the social world, and the divine world, and time is wrapped on itself in this really important way. Now, what happens in the axial age is this way of looking at things is shattered. Now, it doesn't go away. There's aspects of our thinking that are still like this, but what gets layered on top of it is a totally different worldview, a totally different mythology for understanding the relationship between the self and the world. So Charles Taylor talks about this as the great disembedding. When the axial revolution hits, this world is replaced by a different one. Now, again, I'm speaking mythologically here. People will talk about it mythologically, and you have to understand that doesn't mean the way we would think of it as a literal scientific thing, nor is it what we would merely call metaphorical. Mythological is neither scientific nor just metaphorical. Now, what's this new world? Well, this new mythological worldview uses a mythology of two worlds. And the idea is, this is the everyday world. This is the world of the untrained mind. This is a world that is beset by self-deception, self-destruction, illusion, violence, chaos. It's a world in which we are out of touch with reality. But opposed to this is the real world. Now, mythologically, you can talk about this as two worlds, but of course, in a lot of the traditions, the real world is just cutting through the illusion of the everyday world. But the idea is the real world is how the trained mind, the wise mind, sees the world. This is how the world looks when you're in touch with reality, when your mind is not beset by illusion and delusion, when you have that sense that this is how things really are. This is a world also in which there is reduced suffering and violence, precisely because the mind is not beset by foolishness, precisely because it is not out of touch with reality. Now here, wisdom is power-oriented. To be a wise individual is to learn how to acquire the power that was imbued at creation into the cycles. It's like energy's put into the system and it cycles around, and then energy's put in the system and it cycles around, and you want to tap into that power. Wisdom is how to tap into that power. Because what you're after is like long life. Live long and prosper, as it's in the Star Trek mythology for the Vulcans, right? You want to be prosperous, you want to live long, you want to be free of conflict, right? You want to provide security for your offspring. So that's a sense of wisdom that is still captured in our sense of the word prudence, right? Being very prudential is to have that sort of knowing how to fit into the power structures of your society, how to make things work for you, getting the most power and prosperity you can. But over here, there's a radical change. Wisdom changes because, look, you do not want to fit into this world. Because this is the world of suffering and violence. It's a world in which you're out of touch with what's real. And as we'll talk about it later, you deeply desire to be in touch with reality. It's one of your most powerful drives. You don't want to conform to this world. You want to be transformed out of this world. You want to move from here to here. Now notice what's happening here. The old shamanic enacted myth of soul flight, flying above, is being exapted into a new sense. It's being exapted into this sense of self-transcendence, out of the everyday world into the real world. And wisdom is now knowing how to make that transformative leap. And meaning isn't about just connectedness as it was here, but a special kind of connectedness. A connectedness to the real world as opposed to a detrimental connectedness to an illusory world. So meaning is changing. And the notion of wisdom is changing. And the notion of yourself, what it is to be a self. Because here you're defined largely by how you fit in. And of course, that's always going to be part of our definition. I'm talking about emphasis here. I'm not talking about absolute differences. But here you're defined more by how you fit in. But here you're defined increasingly more by how you can self-transcend, self-transform. How you can grow as a person. Notice how pervasive this has become in our self-understanding. Notice how we don't like to be with people who aren't growing, who aren't somehow transcending, growing. Which way do you growing up, right? Becoming more mature, getting more in touch with themselves and reality. So this is called the great disembedding because now we have a different relationship to the everyday world. And this is a metaphor that you don't see before, you don't see over here. This is the idea that we're somehow strangers in the world. We're pilgrims. We don't belong here, we belong there. Now, as I keep saying, I mean, some people, of course, will literalize this, and this is really one world and another world. Most people will see this like we talk about Plato and others. They're understanding this as a mythological representation for the process of self-transcendence and self-transformation. So, once again, we see the acceptation, just like the shamans were engaged in acceptation, we see the acceptation of that shamanic ability into this new mythological framework. Okay, so there's three places that I want to talk about in particular about this, because they're the ones that we're going to talk a lot about. I will mention China periodically throughout, especially when I talk about Taoism, but I want to talk about Greece and ancient Israel because those are the two foundational world mythologies for us. Those are two places in which the axial revolution took place in a way that has become deeply, deeply constitutive of what we are, how we are still here in our minds, the way we experience ourselves and the world. I also want to talk about India because India is the source of that, how do I put it? That source of the confluence between Buddhism and the Western world that we talked about in the first session together. the mindfulness revolution. Mindfulness is a psychotechnology that came from India. So the axial revolution of Siddhartha Gautama and the Buddha, we're going to talk about that. And what I want to talk about is how each one of these areas, in addition to the axial psychotechnologies of literacy and coinage, alphabetic literacy and coinage, right, how they also develop particular psychotechnologies that have become internalized. A lot of what you think is natural to you, just part of how your mind works, is actually culturally internalized. It has been generated historically, and you have internalized it culturally, and you think of it just as how your mind works. Think again about literacy. It is hard for you to remember, and I mean to reenact what it was like to not be able to think in, right, like literate terms, to imagine words. In a similar way, a lot of these ways of thinking, these psychotechnologies, have become so second nature to us that we forget the historical origin. And that's problematic, because the degree to which we don't have a historical understanding is a degree to which we are going to be ignorant of the historical factors that are driving the meaning crisis. Let me foreshadow that meaning crisis right now. So this is a mere foreshadowing. We're going to come back to it. This is a mythological way of thinking which allows us to articulate and train the psychotechnologies of the axial revolution, these psychotechnologies of self-transcendence, of wisdom and enhanced meaning. But the problem is, this mythology is failing for us now. The scientific worldview is destroying the possibility of this for us in a way that might seem sort of cosmically ironic. The scientific worldview is returning us to a continuous cosmos. There is no radical difference in kind between you and the primates that you evolved from naturally. There isn't some radical difference in kind between your mind and your embodied existence, right? Science is leveling the world. We're returning to a one world. We're going to talk about that. But if we can no longer live in this mythology, and that's what mythologies are, they have to be livable. People claim to believe this. Don't tell me what you believe. Tell me what you can practice. Tell me what's livable for you. For most of us, we can't live this anymore. We still talk this way, but we can't live it. So here's part of the problem. This is a foreshadowing. How do we salvage the ability to cultivate wisdom, self-transcendence, enhance meaning, overcome self-deception, realize who we are and how the world is, when we can no longer use the mythological worldview in which it was born? We are going through a re-embedding. It's been progressive and increasing, right? Copernicus and Galileo re-embed us. Darwin re-embeds us. Einstein re-embeds us. We're being re-embedded back into the physical world, but we don't want to lose all that we gained through the great disembedding. How do we reconcile those? How do we live with the legacy of the axial revolution when we can no longer inhabit its worldview? That's part of the problem. That's only part. Now, the place I want to turn to first is ancient Israel. As I mentioned, some of you have probably read parts of the Bible, or at least heard parts of the Bible, although biblical illiteracy is rising. And that's problematic, not because I think people should be Christians or Jews. I'm not here to proselytize. But the degree to which you don't have a grasp of the grammar of the Bible is a degree to which you don't have a grasp of the grammar of your own cognition. And you may say, I'm an atheist. I don't care. That's irrelevant. I'm not talking about what you say. I'm talking about how you think. There's a big difference there. Grammar is how you put thoughts together. It's not the vocabulary. It's not what you say. So this is what Nietzsche meant. And like when he said, I fear we are not getting rid of God because we still believe in grammar. We still talk this way. We still are filled with the God grammar of the Bible. And you say, no, I'm not. Yes, you go to a movie and you watch the person who falls in some way, and then they have an insight and they are redeemed and they find their way back. Maybe it's through Alcoholics Anonymous or they come out of addiction. That's biblical grammar. Okay? Again, what matters here is how it shapes our sense of self and world. I'm not advocating for a particular religion, but of course I am going to talk about the Judeo-Christian heritage precisely because I want to explain to you how these psychotechnologies have become part of the very grammar, not only of your cognition, but of your existential sense of being. So, there's an important psychotechnology that's invented, or at least significantly developed by ancient Israel. Perhaps it was influenced from Persia through Zarathustra, but it's this idea, and when I say it, it's going to seem to you like, of course, but it's not of course. Even saying of course is important. Remember that. Here's the idea. It's a psychotechnology of understanding time as a cosmic narrative, as a story. It's applying something, again, that's universal. All cultures tell stories, and we'll talk about the cognitive science of this later. But you see, this isn't a story. This is a circle. It's a cycle. What kind of structure does a story have? Well, a story has a beginning. It has some crucial climax, turning point. And there's a resolution. There's a direction to it. There's a purpose to it. So you get this idea of cosmic history, of using our skills for story to explain how the cosmos is unfolding through time. It's a radical idea. So why is it radical? Well, notice the difference here. This is not an open future. Right? You're condemned to repeat. So cultures where cyclical time is still prevalent, Eastern cultures, for example, the repetition of the cycle is onerous. It's horrible. People think reincarnation, for example, within an Indian context is a wonderful, I'll be born again. No, that's horrible. What you're trying to do is get free from those cycles. Because doing this again and again and again and again and again is terrifying. Moksha, you want freedom. Nirvana, you want cessation. You want release from the cycle because there is no purpose to it. But here, the future's open. Your actions now can change the future. If you figure out how to participate, remember that participatory knowing. If you figure out how to participate in the story, your actions can change the future. There isn't the all-at-once creation at the beginning. There's an ongoing creation through history. And you can participate with God in the ongoing creation of the future. How? Because how do stories operate? They operate in terms of meaning and morality. How you make meaning. The moral content of your action decides how things are going to go. See, this is why the God of ancient Israel is such a different God. If you look at the gods of the pre-axial world, look, you've got a God and it's a God of a place, a particular function. Here's the god of weaving, or here's the god of ancient Thebes, right? The gods are located in place, they're tied to a function, they have no significant moral arc attached to them. What's the God of the Old Testament? What's he or she like. It's not bound to time and place. Think of the great story of the Old Testament, the story of the Exodus. Right? Here you have the Israelites, and they are imprisoned. They're imprisoned in the epitome of the Bronze Age world, Egypt. And God comes and liberates them and sets them on a journey towards a future that is promised, the promised land. This God moves through time and space. The God of the Old Testament is the God of the open future. That's why at first he has no name. Because to name something is to locate it, to specify it, to tie it down. And for the longest time, this God has no name. And then, when Moses finally challenges it and he reveals his name, he says, it's badly translated in the older versions of the Bible. It's often translated as I am that I am. But it actually in the Hebrew means I will be what I will be. I am the God of the open future. And you can participate with me in this ongoing creation of the future. Because you can shape it. You can cause it to come to resolution, but you can also cause it to go off course. The idea, when I said of course to you, remember? The sense of time passing as a course. We still take courses in universities. This is what we have here. And you're looking for turning points where the course turns. And of course, that's what you're looking for in a movie. You know at some level that none of that is how the real world works. You know at some level, come on, you do, that your life doesn't unfold like a movie. Yet you love it. You love going to a movie. You love seeing this structure and participating in it. And there's the great turning point where something is learned or a problem is solved and there's resolution and the future is now made. So, this God is interested in, becomes progressively, now again, you can't point and say, there's where it changed in the Bible, but you can see there's aspects of a pre-axial God, but as you read through the Old Testament, God becomes more and more axial. He becomes more and more the deity of something that you now take for granted. Progress. The idea, and right, for us it's not just an idea, right? It's in the lifeblood, it's in the very bones of your sense of self in your life. Is your life progressing? Or are you stuck? Is it moving forward? This is this idea. History progresses, and it can degenerate, and it can improve. God becomes more and more a representative of that. Now, there's a technical term for these turning points, Kairos. It's developed by the theologian Paul Tillich. This is this sense of the crucial turning point, getting things at the right time and the right place to turn things, either right back on course or to further develop them. Now let's talk about that, because again, we're going to go back to talking about these senses of knowing that we've lost touch with. Important is this sense, the da'ath. So people sometimes note, and often humorously, that the Bible will talk about sex, sexual intercourse, with the verb knowing. So you'll get things like Adam knew his wife Eve. And he's like, what does that mean? And it means has sex with. It's da'ath in this sense. And it's like, what? Why? What? We don't use sex as a metaphor for knowledge. You'd be surprised how many cultures actually do. Because this is, again, this is a participatory sense. There's a course here, and you're participating in it. Now, what do I mean by participating? You don't know it from the outside, just having beliefs about it, or just having skills. You know it in this way. You know it by identifying with it. You change it while it's changing you, and you're changing it while it's changing you. You are immersed in it like a stream, like a course of a river. You are participating in it. When you're making love with somebody, you are participating in them. You're identifying with them, empathizing with them, resonating with them. You are changing them as they are changing you. And it rises, forgive me the pun, to a climax, to a turning point, to a resolution. See, in ancient Israel, faith, this term has become useless for us now, but faith didn't mean believing ridiculous things for which there is no evidence. That is a recent idea. That is not what it meant. Faith was your sense of dahath. Faith was your sense that you're in this reciprocal realization. You're in course. You're on course. You're involved and evolving with things. It's your sense, I'm on course. Or even your sense, this is the turning point, and I know what to do. I know who I need to change into. I knew how to turn myself and things. Notice you have this in your relationships. You'll often be asking yourself, how's this relationship going? Is it on course? Is it progressing? Is it growing? Is this the kind of person I want to be? Am I becoming? What's my sense of how I'm changing? Is this all going well? That's the ath. Now, of course, you can get it wrong. You can think you're on course when you're actually dramatically off course. You're trespassing, to use older biblical language. You're walking off the path. You're no longer on course. That's the basis of a word that we can't use anymore again because of our biblical literacy and the fact that we've lost touch with this sense of knowing. In fact, this word, many people treat this word almost like a comical word, sin. Sinning isn't just doing something very immoral. Right? In the New Testament, the word that translates this is when you're shooting a bow and arrow. So if you've done archery, you can't shoot for where your eye tells you to look because you'll actually miss the bullseye. You have to have a kind of faith to sense, right, where you need to actually shoot so you don't miss the mark. So the idea here is I'm trying to sense the course of things, and if I'm self-deluded or illusory, I'm actually dramatically off course without realizing it. That's the original meaning. And so the idea is that human beings are thrown into this universe in which they have the option, because it's an open future, of participating in the creation of the future. But of course, human beings sin in the sense that they are self-deceptive. They go off course. So notice what the Hebrews are doing. They're taking this movement from the everyday world to the real world, and they're turning it into a historical story. The way you go from the false world to the real world is you start now and you move towards the promised land. They understand it historically. But human beings sin. They make decisions that steer the course of history away from its culmination. And so the idea is God has to intervene periodically. God has to redeem. God has to do something to wake people up, to remind them, to help them to sense how they've gone off course, and so that they can come back on course. And so what you have is you have in the Old Testament, you have the creation of the prophetic tradition, prophets. Here's another thing that we've lost the sense of. A prophet is not somebody who tells the future like some sort of psychic. Okay? Prophecy isn't about telling you what's going to be happening 200 or 300 years from now. Prophecy means a telling forth. The job of the prophet is to wake you up right now to how you are off course. So a better analogy isn't the psychic when you go to the psychic and, oh, you will meet a tall, dark stranger or some crap like that. That's not a good analogy for a prophet. A better prophet is when you and your loved one go into therapy and the therapist says something and it wakes you up to, holy crap, this is how I'm going wrong. This is how I'm off course. This is how I need to get back on track. That's the job of a prophet. And what you have in the prophetic tradition is you have an increasing emphasis on the morality of human decision making. More and more, and again, it's not perfect. There's all kinds of pre-axial stuff that's still woven in there and mixed up with it and mashed up with it. But you do have more and more this discussion, this exhortation to wake up to your moral responsibility for helping everybody to get back on track and to turn things back towards the promised land. This idea of justice and righteousness and waking up so that we get back on track become endemic. Now think about how much, and I've tried to show you through examples, how much this is just how you naturally think of yourself. You think of yourself as somebody who's on a journey. You're starting here, and you're trying to make a better self, and you're trying to make the right decisions, and you're trying to steer things. You want your life to progress. You want your culture to progress. Try to think about how you would understand yourself, how you would judge yourself, and you couldn't make use of this notion of progress. So, what starts to happen is a commitment to more and more trying to cultivate the wisdom of deeply remembering God, which doesn't mean reciting beliefs, it means participating in the ongoing creation of the world, shaping the future, helping yourself, your neighbors, and your society to progress, where that progress is measured mostly in terms of moral improvement, increasing justice, increasing flourishing, increasing sense of people living up to their promise. And this is what I ask you. Do you feel like you're living up to your promise? Is it an important thing for you? If it is, and I feel it's probably the case that for many of you it is, that very way of thinking, that's part of the grammar that we have inherited from the Hebrews. It's part of the very way we think. It's part of the warp and woof of our cognition. Now we're going to come back to this strand. We're going to come back and look at a particular way of understanding Kairos that became central in Christianity. Because what Christianity did is it made a really radical claim. It claimed that this Kairos was found in a particular person. And what that's going to do is it's going to personalize all of this in a really dramatic way. But before we do that, I want to switch back over to what's happening at a similar time in ancient Greece. So as I mentioned, the psychotechnology of alphabetic literacy is taken to the Greeks, but the Greeks do something that's very important, and it helps to explain, right, some of the differences we see in the Greek axial revolution from the ancient Hebrew axial revolution. Now, the Greeks do something that, again, seems inconsequential now, but they add vowels to the alphabet. And it's like, oh, wow, so what? Well, the thing is, when you add vowels, you really, again, increase how easy it is to process information. So let's stop here because we need to do a bit cognitive science. Because this ease of processing really matters. So I want to introduce you to an important idea from cognitive science. This is the idea of cognitive fluency. So we've got increasing experimental evidence for this basic kind of fact. When you increase the ease at which people can process information, regardless of what that information is, they come to believe it is more real, they have more confidence in it, etc. Now, that can be something very simple. It can be as simple as changing the font contrast between the letters and the page. So, consider two individuals, Tom and Susan. Tom is reading words in which the color contrast between the letters and the page isn't as good as the color contrast that Susan's reading. They're reading exactly the same thing. They can both clearly read it. It's just the font difference makes it easier for Susan than for Tom. They read the same thing. If you ask both of them, well, how true is what you read? Susan's more likely to say that was true. She's more likely to have confidence in it, regardless of the content. The fluency of your processing actually increases your confidence in it, your sense of how real the picture it's giving you is. Now, it's not really ease in some simple sense because, right, it has to do more with how well your brain is accessing information, applying it. It's very complicated, right? But what I'm telling you is when I do something that increases your cognitive fluency, you get an enhanced sense of your brain. Your brain generates an enhanced sense that you're actually in touch with things. We'll talk about this later. That turns out to be a good policy your brain is using. It's a very good idea for your brain to try and use the fluency of its own processing as a measure of how much it's in touch with reality. By the way, when you get a lot of fluency, you of course are going to get into the flow state. So when the Greeks introduced vowels, they improve the fluency of alphabetic literacy. They ramp up how powerful it is. They also introduce something else. They introduce a standardized reading from left to right, which you now take for granted. Many of you know that other languages go the other way. Hebrew is read this way, for example. That has an impact on your cognition. First of all, it's standardized. That improves the fluency. Why does it improve your fluency? When this is standard, you know always, if you look at Egyptian hieroglyphs, they can go up, they can go down, they can go this way, they can go that way. When you standardize things, that increases the fluency of the processing. So they ratchet up this power of literacy to enhance cognition. They're also developing something else. So the Greeks don't form a unified nation state. They have individual city-states that are in competition with each other. And in Athens in particular, and Athens is going to be the hotbed of the axial revolution in Greece, although not the only place. In Athens, you have slowly the emergence of democracy. Now, it's a particularly problematic form of democracy. It's direct democracy. We'll talk about stuff like that later. But what this does is this puts a premium on argumentation and debate. So the Greeks start to sort of speed up the axial revolution in their own cognition. They enhance the effects of alphabetic literacy. They enhance, right, the use of reason and reflection. And so they start to do things that, again, don't happen before. Lots of cultures were doing arithmetic, but the Greeks invent mathematics. They invent geometry. They start to create abstract symbol systems for their own sake. Now that's what's going on in what's basically being invented in ancient Greece is this capacity for rational argumentation. That's the psychotechnology. Again, you think of this. Now, I want to be clear here. I'm not claiming that other groups or people are irrational or they can't be reasonable. I'm not being ethnocentric. But you get the explicit training of rational argumentation as a core psychotechnology in ancient Greece. Now that is going to have very important consequences. Now what's interesting again is how this comes in to ancient Greece. I'm going to introduce you to two individuals who are sort of the epitome of the axial revolution in Greece. Pythagoras and Socrates. You know Pythagoras, of course, because of an important mathematical theorem, the Pythagorean theorem. Now, Pythagoras is a very interesting person because he seems to be, he belongs to, Cornfield makes this argument very well, right? Cornfield makes this argument very well. He belongs to a group of individuals that are around, you know, sort of just coming out of that dark age, around 600 BCE. These individuals were called the divine men. It's pretty clear that these men seem to represent a rediscovery of shamanic psychotechnologies. They have a lot of associations with sort of capacities for healing, for flying through the air. And so a lot of this is legendary, right? It's mythological, it's not literal. But Pythagoras is a real person. Now, of course, there's lots and lots of legendary material around him, but the legend even points towards these important aspects. He seems to have gone through shamanic training. He engaged in something called the Thunderstone ceremony, which involved him isolating himself in a cave, going through some radical transformation, and then coming out of it. He seems to have experienced soul flight because he talked about the capacity for the psyche to be liberated from the body. He was very tall and he dressed like a god, but no one found it offensive for him to do so, at least not the people that followed him. He discovers, and this, right, he discovers the octave. He discovers that there's mathematical proportions in the world. He comes to this realization that this new psychotechnologies of rational reflection and mathematics give us access to abstract patterns that we are not directly aware of. Like we all take it for granted that we know what an octave is and we know that it can be expressed by ratios, but that was his discovery. So what he does is he takes this idea about realizing through music and math these abstract patterns, and then he links them to the project, the shamanic ability to engage in self-transcendence. He comes up with the idea that we're somehow trapped in this world, but we can learn to fly above it. We can fly free, like the shaman. But he's allied it explicitly to the axial project of self-transcendence, of getting in touch with the rationally realized patterns. Because that will liberate us. That will change and transform us. Now, Pythagoras gives us a lot of the words that we take for granted. I said earlier that I didn't like calling the pre-axial world a cosmos because Pythagoras actually invents this word cosmos. He's the first person to describe the universe as a cosmos. Now, many of you probably treat those two terms as synonymous. Universe, the one verse, and cosmos. They're not. Try to think of a word that's actually related to cosmos that you're familiar with. So the word that might not come to mind is the word cosmetic. Cosmetics come from cosmos. What do cosmetics do? They, reveal the beauty of things, how beautiful and ordered they are. So Pythagoras has the idea that if we can use music and mathematical thinking and practices that engage in this altered state of consciousness, and he's integrating them all together. It's not quite clear how, but what we can do is we can transcend and see the world as beautiful. And we're going to come back and talk about this, how when people have awakening experiences, they suddenly experience the world as a cosmos, as radically beautiful. Now remember Pythagoras, because he's going to have a huge influence on somebody we're going to talk about, Plato. But there's somebody who had an even greater influence on Plato, and somebody who really epitomizes the axial revolution in ancient Greece. In fact, he has a revolution named after him. This is called the Socratic Revolution. And the person we want to talk about is Socrates. I'm going to argue how Socrates epitomizes the Greek form of the axial revolution. And then what we're going to do is we're going to see how Plato takes Socrates and Pythagoras and puts them together, and how Socratic and Platonic your cognition is, how it's part of the grammar of how you think. But once again, even though that's the grammar of how we understand meaning and wisdom and what a self is and how we grow, how we self-transcend, how we get in touch with reality, we are no longer in the worldview of Pythagoras. Do you actually, I mean this seriously, do you actually experience the universe as a cosmos? We'll take a look at that the next time we're together. Thank you very much for your time.
Hey guys, so we're just going to take a little intermission here. Let's say 10 minutes, 12 minutes.
Maybe 5?
No, I need a bit more time here to get stuff going. So let's just say we'll meet back at about 10 minutes from now.
10 after, approximately.
Yeah. All right, just going to mark this in. You guys can hear me, right? That's probably a good idea to check here.
Can somebody
All
type
right,
in
so
the chat?
11 minutes we'll go. So chat is still active here. You guys can keep discussing there. So the way we are thinking about like hosting this conversation, I think we've already got a full group today. We're not really sure if like this Patreon thing is going to work. Someone in the chat was already mentioning this. So yeah, we'll discuss it and we'll figure out a way to do it better if that's what we need to do. And
For
maybe
next
like
week, yeah.
So we'll just keep it the way it is this week, and then I guess we will have a discussion about this at the end of this discussion, probably something like that.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, the video discussion group is full, but everybody can still keep engaging in the chat, of course.
Yeah, if there's still room, we'll post a link, and then we'll just do first come, first serve. So whoever jumps in. All right, I'll see you guys in 10 minutes.
Thank you. Good. How are you doing?
Yeah, that's what I was going to do. Yeah, and I just want to say I'm super grateful for you guys doing this.
Yeah.
I recognize the challenge of getting all of it done, and you're doing a beautiful job with it. Say I'm super grateful for you guys doing this.
Okay, I'm hearing a time lapse in there.
If you have the video playing on YouTube still, you'll be hearing the audio from that as well.
Oh,
so
okay, that's what it is. Okay.
Yeah.
Hey guys, sorry, I didn't realize I still had desktop audio going on the stream, so I just shut it off. Anyway, we'll be discussing in 3 minutes. Everything's enabled.
Sorry about that. Technical issues.
Hey guys, sorry we're a
Yeah.
bit late. Technical issues. We've let everyone in who was pre-booked. The link is futurethinkers.org/watch if you want to come in and join.
I already
think
posted it.
Yeah,
in,
you put it in the chat. If I think we'll probably stop at about 10 people, 8 to 10, something like that. So first come, first serve. All right, and I just asked David what he thought about it. So he had already said a lot. Maybe he wants to repeat that.
Yeah, the thing about this one that really kind of blows me away is one, the contrast between continuous world and the two worlds, and how much we don't recognize that, how much that's shifted over time. I mean, the historical context, really understanding that people used to see it as a continuous world, and that the axial revolution really changed that, and that the way that we see things now is sort of embedded in us by culture and isn't necessarily natural or the only way to see things is really kind of tricky. And where some of the psychotechnologies, we kind of know that we learn them, like literacy and numeracy, the fact that we learn those in school and that impacts the way that we think things is pretty amazing. But there are other aspects of this, which one of the interviews that I heard with John Vervaeke talked about narrative, just the fact of narrative and the fact that we have a recursive self-identity in that we know who we are by the stories we tell ourselves isn't innately human. That's something that's a psychotechnology that's installed by culture and learned, and it's one of the reasons that we tell children and we run through narrative stories in kindergarten and preschool. You know, that's installing that software of, oh, here's complex characters and events over time and the way that they relate and the way and the moral of the story. So when he's talking in this about the narrative arc in movies, that we somehow think that that's the way life is, and he says, come on guys, you don't actually think your life unfolds that way. And there's a part of me, even as he says that, and even as I know it, I protest a little bit. It's like, no, but wait a minute, it kind of does. And it's so much the part of how I make sense of the world is culturally installed in a way that constrains the way that I see things. And so part of the, and it was actually part of what was fascinating me about the chat discussion was, oh, but wait, why doesn't he acknowledge this or that? And it's like, because that acknowledgement isn't a truth. Any frame that we have about the way that we think about things is this is dangerous territory, but is largely socially constructed. That is such a challenging notion. And he approaches it, I think, with such skill and care in this, as he's unpacking this and breaking this apart. It gives us room to kind of explore this he's doing what he, in a different mode, what he's saying shaman do. He's breaking us out of our frame, letting us look above it, not saying necessarily this is the truth, but this is the landscape that you're using to make sense of the world. He says this in another thing where, looking through my glasses, I'm not aware of my glasses at all, but then you pull them off and look, and it's like, oh yeah, I can see how these things are shaping what I see. But then I put them back on and I'm no longer aware of them. So it's like that ability to step above and step back into. And so a lot of what he's saying here in the axial revolution is, I think, in some ways the most profound and kind of almost hardest to get how deeply embedded some of these ideas are. But that's the overall theme that I get most from this.
But how deeply embedded do you think? Because if that were the case, then wouldn't you expect there to be some different culturally embedded things in how we view the world between the Eastern and the Western culture? And I would think that the way we view things through narratives, like you described, are universal almost. That they are not necessarily psychotechnologies that are embedded within culture, but that they may, at least to some extent, be observations rather than something that's embedded in culture. So, for example, philosophers and thinkers, how is that different in the East?
You broke up a little bit. Between which thinkers? What's the difference between?
Well, he uses a lot of Western thinkers. So one of the things I would be curious about is if this were the case, then I would expect the Eastern cultures and Eastern traditions that don't have
Between which thinkers? What's the difference between?
Well,
If somebody still has the YouTube video playing in the background, please mute it.
Yeah.
So if they have cultures that don't have a lot of their basis on these Western thinkers, Greek philosophers, I would expect them to have a different psychotechnology that they developed through their own thing, unless it was something more akin to an observation. Does that make sense?
He actually talks about this in later videos.
Maybe I'm not to those yet.
Yeah, when he covers the Eastern mystics and the Eastern traditions, he talks about some of the differences and some of the similarities, because there was actually quite a lot of exchange of ideas happening between East and West at the time. And to what you said earlier, this idea, like what came first, he actually covers that as well, that it's like the chicken and the egg thing. It's difficult to tease those apart. He calls them agent and arena. So is it the people influencing the society, or is it society influencing people? Well, it's both. So, you know, people notice patterns, they put them into words, they transmit those patterns, then those patterns become psychotechnologies, and then everybody views the world through those lenses and ends up acting them out.
Yes, this is the knowledge development cycle. Yes.
You know, it's interesting. I was just talking to somebody who's teaching young children, especially working with kids who have issues with, learning disabilities. But she said that this generation that's coming up actually has a different sense of self. In her perception, she's watching them. She said, you and I pretty much see ourselves as here, primarily. And they said they see themselves as this relationship between phone and self. This is their identity, much more than we think. This is a tool that extends my identity. For them, it's primary, it's identity. And so it's an extreme kind of a version of that, but it is kind of a notion that the way that the tools shape us, the way that our concepts and frames shape what we see, we haven't even got really into the depths of relevance realization, but how much what appears to us is a complex function of what's come before and the meaning that we have and how we've mapped that out. I think that the thing that's interesting, is you ask about the difference between East and West, and I've had some other people say there's some frustration that he focuses so much on Western. He does include some Eastern thought, but not nearly as much as Western. There's a whole lot of bias that direction. And I think in part it's because it's challenging enough. I mean, it's just limiting it to the West is already 50 hours long. And I don't think there's anything, so not very much that's extraneous in that 50 hours. So it really is just I think there was a very judicious way of like, okay, we're going to focus on this and we're going to include some of the East. But I do think that the East and West has some very distinct models of the way that the world looks. He doesn't talk about that as much and goes into as much detail, but there are definitely very different worldviews. I mean, the Taoist thinking is very difficult for Western people to really get a good sense of. We sort of understand it after the fact rather than primary. We tend to think much more, I think, top down rather than interrelated, as an example.
One thing that I find really, the thing that kind of grasped me most in the lecture that really grabbed me was the idea that when he foreshadowed the meaning crisis and that we're returning to a continuous cosmos. And then thinking about how if the way we view things through this kind of historical narrative is a psychotechnology, then you would expect the kind of biblical grammar movie idea to start to give way. And this idea I've come across a few times recently of collective journey starting to kind of nudge out hero's journey as an interesting way of presenting a story. So, for example, in Game of Thrones, there are individual characters who have a hero's journey story, but there are many main characters who randomly die at various points in the story, just like we experience in life, right? And if you go through the whole narrative, there's many times where things don't work out or the climax doesn't happen where you expect. Like, it's much more closer to the way that we experience life. And I think that narrative is, those new forms of narrative are starting to trickle up into entertainment.
We've had a bit of experience traveling around and experiencing post-collapse societies.
And also different cultures that are just non-Western.
Yeah. And it's interesting, this sort of collective identity aspect of that is left over from post-communist countries, even though a lot of them are totally capitalist now, totally Western, but there's this mentality that's still left over from communism where people identify within groups far more than as individuals. That takes a lot longer to change in people. And I wonder if this, like, it would be interesting to study that historical transition into these more collectivist mindsets from more individual mindsets, because I have this suspicion it might be quite similar. It might look quite similar to what we're seeing now in the West.
There's also a thing here, because it's not just collective versus individualistic. I think what we might be going into is some sort of a both and. And we've talked about this actually in last week's discussion, where sovereignty and collective intelligence are not opposite of each other. They can happen simultaneously. So you can be a sovereign individual while participating in collective intelligence. Like, you don't necessarily lose your individuality by doing that. So I really think that that's what the transition is. We're trying to integrate those two things. Or like John Vervaeke is saying, we're trying to integrate the continuous cosmos with the two worlds view. I don't think we're fully returning to continuous cosmos. I haven't gotten to the further parts of the series where he would address this directly, but I suspect that that's the case.
It's interesting, just coming back to what both of you were saying. They recently noted that in Disney films for children now, the interest is in stories where collaboration between characters actually leads to the ultimate success. So amongst children, and especially grown men, Frozen was an unexpected success because it was two sisters who got along in order to defeat, and well, not even to defeat, but in order to save the day. And it's interesting to see when the stories of the very youngest of us are shifting towards collaboration rather than a single man with a sword being able to save the princess comes along, and what that may actually mean for the generations to come. So I was really happy to hear, how all of these different tendencies parallel sometimes each other.
Yeah, I want to kind of piggyback on that because I noticed something that's happening with my kids and the board games that are out now. There's a lot of collaborative games. Like Pandemic is one where we all have our roles and we work together to save the world from a disease that's taken over. And they love that stuff. So there's so many more options out there like that now.
That reminds
Great
me
game.
of something that in our interview with Jordan Hall, he talked about his preteen children playing Minecraft and how this seemed to be intuitive to them. They just fell into this state of collective consciousness where they didn't plan anything. They didn't assign roles. They just kind of intuitively came together and built something amazing. Like they had
It was,
several.
it was a school assignment
Yeah.
for them to go into Minecraft and build some cathedral or something. And they didn't, his typical way of thinking, in our kind of older singular Western mindset was that you need to plan this out. You need to delegate responsibilities. There needs to be, a checklist going forward. And then it was just such an emergent organization with these young kids. No
Yeah.
decision making in terms of like a pyramid structure, hierarchical structure. It was just,
Yeah,
I want to build over here. I want to build over here. And they just made this brilliant cathedral.
and then somebody else was like narrating, and somebody else was doing the camera, kind of like showing the progress, and somebody else was making the music, and people just self-organized, and he was blown away by this.
It's funny because so many of our TV shows are actually trying to show how we can't get along. Like, what is it? You're Fired, Trump's TV show, where people are just meant to like come up with I think they're supposed to set up a tent together and collaboratively, and people started shouting. One of the other wanted to be a leader, and I'm wondering if that's because they're expected to fail, or if it's actually because they're another generation, or for a multitude of reasons. But I'm absolutely not convinced that as soon as you put a bunch of people together, they're necessarily going to try and scramble for the spotlight. Yeah.
This idea of having an operating system or a psychotechnology that allows you to do something, I think is really relevant here. It's like the older generations don't have the programming to be able to do that intuitively, and maybe the young kids do.
In some of my experience and some of the group dynamics that I've been on and different teams, it seems like there is a minimum level of a capacity for communication that's required. Not just education, that's a little bit different, but the ability to communicate and collaborate before that can really take place naturally. I don't think that if you just grabbed a random set of people that you would find that they would just do that. I think that is, again, more common in what seems to be people are experiencing with the younger generations, that they are more like that.
I witnessed something kind of interesting a few weeks ago at a conference. I was there for this, the Emerge Festival. What was the other name for it?
Metamodern
Art Festival. And there was a group, like quite a large group of Swedish people there, I think about 30 to 50 or something like that, and a lot of them all lived in this co-living environment back in Stockholm called K9. You guys can research that. It's an experiment of co-living in larger communities, and they've really purposely designed the entire environment to accommodate this number of people, so that people can have like optional shared spaces or be in different types of environments. Like there's several types of kitchens that they have there, so that you can have a big kitchen party or a small kitchen party or something like that. So that's what I noticed actually watching these guys was that they have a much higher level of social interaction than is common, because they're so commonly surrounded by people. It's not like they go to their little boxes at home and interact only with family members, or even less than that, just going home alone. These guys are constantly surrounded by other people, and they care about each other, and they have to care about each other because the whole social cohesion of the environment collapses if they don't have like a rule set and a culture in place to enforce and encourage that type of social behavior. So in watching them interact at a big dinner, I think I was one of the few people at a large dinner party that wasn't from this collective, and they're just so emotionally in tune with one another, and they so care, and they're so physical with each other. It was really interesting to see. So, in my mind, it was like, if I just saw one of these people on their own, I would think that's just a really socially aware person, something special and unique about them. Maybe they were raised better than the rest of us or something. But I can see now that it's actually just practice. In their adulthood, they're getting a lot more practice by being around more people.
There's a really good example as well of some sort of spontaneous cooperation and organization with Christiana in Copenhagen, the free town,
Yes.
where in the 1970s, a bunch of people who I believe were squatting just went, this land is not being occupied, and the police keep pushing us off because somehow we're not the owners legally and officially, and ended up, deciding that over 7 hectares of this land was now going to become a town in and of itself that was not going to belong to the EU. So it's one of the only places in the EU that's actually out of the EU, and they consider themselves an autonomous and self-governing state. And visiting it does have a strange vibe, but it is very well organized, and that's been going on for 50 years now. So it's a really good example of some sort of anarchist commune. And so, yeah, maybe it's not just the 2019 generations that can spontaneously organize as well.
There's a notion that's in the back of my head. I don't think it's in the video. I don't think that Vervaeke talks about this necessarily, but it's something that I've been tracking a little bit more broadly, which is it has to do with this, and it does relate to the agent arena, the connectedness of the agent and arena. I mean, this video series really brought that to mind. But in some way, what the children are doing whenever they're collaboratively playing a game is they're engaging. There is more of a dancing with the arena. I think that the specialization of whatever they're doing in the Minecraft world that they're creating, and people doing different camera work and all of that is in some way, I think that is probably very much a thing that children do at first, and we teach it out of them. But it's also something that we relearn later on, stuff that, like the work that Jamie Wheel's doing with the Flow Genome Project when he's working with Google, or the Navy SEALs. They work very hard to get into a collaborative group, collective intelligence. And so there is something in we do wake up that sensitivity of being able to listen to the moment, listen to ourselves, listen to the environment, and such that it's a dance. It really is like flocking birds or schooling fish, but that we have had this strong sense of independence, and not only independence, but similarity, right? The frame, I think, has been, we're all the same, and we're kind of starting from the same point. Yes, it's a sort of a strange radical breaking of, you're an individual, but you start with the same reality that we're all in. So that it's I'm a little bit stretched to the moment to think about how there's something more that I want to say here, and I don't know exactly what it is, but it does feel like this awakening moment. And I know what it was. Here was the thing that I was thinking is, when I think about communist countries, and specifically think about China, my father spent some time in China and was amazed at that they, in some sense, have come at it from a different perspective. Their collectivist view is very strongly ingrained. And in a lot of countries outside of the United States, the idea of tall poppies, don't stand out. You want to blend in with the crowd. If you stand out, you'll have your head chopped off. Is very keenly aware. And so one of the things that was really challenging for China coming into modernity was to break this idea that you have to follow everyone. And I think they're probably in a really interesting challenge now of maintaining cohesion with 1.3 billion people. At the same time, they're trying to get innovation and thinking individually. Okay, how do we get the best of both worlds? So they're kind of coming at this from a different perspective than we are. We're trying to reawaken our deeper collective nature. So that this isn't exactly the two worlds perspective, but it's another example of something like that.
It's really interesting what Mike brought up earlier, how it happened in countries that were collectivist for a very long time and had that mentality of don't stick out too much, and if you think differently, then you're an enemy of the state. I mean, I grew up in Russia, and it was like that. And now we're living in Bulgaria, and although Bulgaria was less affected by this, and for a shorter period of time, it's still noticeable. So it seems like what ends up happening after that stops being enforced by the state is it kind of remains in a lot of institutions, and it remains in the unconscious of people. But some people try to consciously break through it, and when they do it in kind of extreme ways. So, for example, a lot of the Russians and Bulgarians that live abroad are some of the most individualistic people that you'll ever meet.
Agree.
And if you
Yeah, we have a Bulgarian in the group.
yeah,
To
and
confirm.
if you try to convince them of any value of collective intelligence, or say collective anything, it like creates a bad taste in their mouth.
Huh, that is.
So one time we brought up collective intelligence in a group discussion with a lot of very smart Bulgarians, and people are like, collective? Ugh, you want to return to communism? No way.
So there's another notion here too. There are, and I've noticed this, there are two kinds of collective, right? There is collective by dint of kind of just the ability of amassing all of the pieces together to kind of do it all together at one time. And then there's also the kind of collective where each of them, this is what you're talking about, when sovereignty doesn't compete with collective, right? The sovereignty, actually, you get a deeper form of collective when the individuals are acting as sovereign agents within the arena and responding together, but uniquely. You know, they each. So here's the other part of this that was really interesting is, in the same way, if we were to think of collective in the way that most socialist or communist countries have tried to do, it's thinking that any difference you see between your two eyes is averaged out. So we still see a two-dimensional view, you know, just the two eyes. But allowing the differences of each eye and then coming together actually gives you the third dimension, actually gives you more dimensionality in seeing what is in the space. So that is a really interesting aspect of how do we integrate both of the unique perspectives of the sovereign perspective and the collective, where we're combining those in a more radical way.
I've been muting people just because of the background noise, just so you know.
Not only the, go ahead.
Can I say something?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Okay, I've been listening and I had a lot of thoughts, and I want to pick up here that there are different kinds of collective. And I would see collectivism in the same way, that there are very different things to be collective, because you are not individually thinking yet, or you don't have this capacity, you don't have sovereignty, or to consciously bring your individualism into something bigger than, to give it, to bring yourself into this. And it's somehow connected into, I'll go back to the notion of time, how we perceive time in history, as we started also with the lecture. And
Valentina,
yes?
Can you get your microphone just up a little closer?
Is it better?
Yeah,
Yes.
much better. Thanks.
Yeah, that's not the best earplugs I have. How I see things is that when we are focused more on the meaning of, or on the patterns of the universe or the cosmos, then our experience is more that we are here and now, or into this eternal now. While if we're focused more on understanding things, or on the story, on the narrative, then we experience the history as going from one spot to another, and it has some purpose in the future. And in our individual life, we experience this. The easiest example I can get is with the trauma, for example. It's entirely in the feelings. We can't really say that we have developed, or we've been moved away from some of our patterns, because when they grab us, we're immediately into the initial pattern. I mean, of course, this can go also in positive examples. It's just something that we all experience somehow. So that's why we say we want to go out of the trauma or something to jump out of this circle of repetitive circle. And so my question is, looking from nowadays, when we have understanding of the history and of the development and of becoming better and basically all the history of the Western civilization, how can we bring this individual perspective of having your own purpose into this collective eternal now and make it not so traumatic, because we understand more about these repetitive patterns. So how to unite both feelings?
That's a really good question. I feel like I have exactly the same kind of query. And the only, I mean, I'm not giving you an answer, but just as my little tidbit is that that's exactly what we're doing right now. Like we're all here trying to make sense. I think we all come from different perspectives. And I guess I would love for other people to respond as well, but listening, properly listening and responding to one another is one of at least the key actions that one can take, at least in response to your question. But I have exactly the same queries as you. I'd love to hear other people.
A big one for me that jumps out is the thing that Yuvi and I end up talking about quite a lot in the podcast, which is about individual cognitive sovereignty. How clearly can you see the world, perceive it, make sense of it, and then take action? And the second one is what you do related to shadow work. I don't know if you guys are all familiar with that subject, but it's basically like uncovering your unconscious dark side or unconscious behaviors, doing specific practices to make the unconscious come to the conscious. And in doing that, I think you can work to be more present and not be hijacked by, like you said, traumas, and operate from that lens instead of that much more clear and sovereign lens. We brought this up before, but Jamie Wheel has had quite a change in the last couple years of work after he wrote Stealing Fire. He's had a lot of frustrations trying to make change in the world because in one story he brings up is that he had a group of billionaires on some sort of retreat or some getaway or project, and what they're working on is reducing plastic pollution in the ocean. And they couldn't get past conversations of triggering and trauma related to race and gender and all kinds of things within their tiny little group of billionaires. So it was pretty interesting that these like high-level decision makers who have power and the ability to do something about a lot of our big problems could do nothing about it because they couldn't get past their own trauma lens. So I think whatever we can do to process trauma is probably the biggest contributor to that.
And if I can just quickly interject, there's your individual trauma and potentially also collective trauma. I mean, one of the ones that comes up, and I know it's a bit cliche, is the Me Too movement. So a lot of trauma that was not spoken. And then I think on another side, a lot of the, would be wary of calling it traumatic, but the experience that some men have had at being suddenly feeling like they were brandished as either misogynist or even worse terms, and how to address that in all of our, in a way that our voices can both be heard and accept other voices as well. I'd love to hear other people's thoughts.
Yeah, I appreciate that you brought that up about the masculine point of view. It's interesting to me because for a lot of men, the idea of there being a collective trauma related to the female experience, because it's only recently come to such a big fervor in the media. It's a new a new thought or a new idea to a lot of men, including myself. It's like I didn't realize how hard it was, how bad it was, until more people spoke up. So, yeah, no point at the end of that.
There's another aspect of this that, it's also my own thought, but it informs a lot of the way that I read Vervaeke, which is that. So I have a practice called circling. It's a collective relating practice, which is a really interesting perspective that gives me some additional frame for some things. And one of the things that it's one of the things that I want to let people know at the beginning if someone's new to circling. It's like, this can actually uncover a sense of trauma. Just the act of being seen, in a way, moving out of a narrative frame of seeing myself, a historical narrative trajectory frame, into the present moment, can cause to come to the surface. My sense is it's something like, this is the way that I imagine it. There's a kind of metaphorical sense of it. It's like the underlying physical experience is the bedrock of my experience, and the narrative landscape on top kind of covers that over. And as I get to the present moment, I sort of uncover that place. And so there is something in the narrative sense making that I've done over time, which is coping with challenges and covering over them, but they're deeply embedded in that. And so when that relationship between the narrative and the present moment changes again, it can bring those traumas right back to the surface in ways that are really not necessarily well known or understood. They can come out of the I can suddenly have a deep sense of despair that seems out of nowhere, and if I try to make sense of it in that moment, I can easily assign that to someone in the room, and it may feel like they're causing that, and it's really just a complex interaction of the things that are happening in the room and the things that have happened to me historically, and as those unflower, come back into the present moment. So so that's one aspect. The other aspect of it is, in some sense, I think this is a deeper and more subtle notion. The whole process of acquiring language is a subtle form of trauma to the body. In some way, learning language is a cultural exaptation of our our somatic sense making by laying language on top of it. And so in a way, what I notice is, as adults, well-behaved adults don't throw fits, right? We silence our bodies. We parent ourselves continually. No, it's not, I don't need to go to the bathroom now. So there are ways in which it's not just language, but our enculturation has us silence our bodies in ways that when it tries to speak, it's kind of like the child wanting attention and pushing it off and saying, no, not now, don't bother me, I'm busy. And we've learned to do that. And in some way, we're now it feels like part of the reason we're at a meaning crisis in the moment is because we're not able to push that off anymore, both collectively because of climate, whatever, regardless of what exactly the issue is climate-wise. There's an awareness of a climate problem, at least in a large part of the population, and culturally, politically, within our families, in the Me Too movement, all of this stuff. It's like, wow, the body needs to be listened to. And so I think this is part of the return of the awareness of the continuous world, and the trauma that's related to that.
Yeah, I agree. And what was brought up before about, you were saying how language is kind of a subtle trauma to the body. I agree with that, and I've experienced that firsthand. Just sitting in meditation in silence and listening to my body without trying to come up with stories about it, and actually shutting off the part of the brain that produces the narrative and the story, brought up so much trauma to the surface and so much suffering. And it took me quite a few years to actually process that. And I've noticed the same with a lot of other people that I've spoken to. When they start doing a lot of meditation, immediately just so much trauma comes up, and they have a dark night of the soul, and they have no idea how to deal with it, and they think that there's something wrong with their meditation practice, but actually is doing exactly what it was supposed to. It's just the stuff had remained repressed for so long, and now it's finally coming to the surface. Like when we went to silent meditation retreats a couple years ago, we saw lots of people dropping out after the first day or two because they just could not handle it.
Or people that stuck with it, even though it was painful, and just broke down crying randomly in different places. You know, another thing comes up for me about this. There was a big discussion at this conference I mentioned before, and one of the men, there's like fishbowl thing where everyone kind of gets in a circle in the entire conference, and there's like a handful of seats, 4 or 5 seats, and 4 microphones, and everyone in the crowd can come up and speak in turn, and then someone else from the inner circle has to leave anytime someone new comes up. And someone brought up the necessity of processing trauma. Exactly this conversation brought up a lot of discussion about climate change and the fact that we have to process trauma related to that. But there's also this sense of urgency, like, no, we need to do something now. We can't sit around all day stroking our feelings and, you know, this kind of like masturbatory thing that I think a lot of men perceived it as. And some guy came up and literally was that character saying that we cannot do that. We can't just sit around processing feelings all day. And you could tell he had this like kind of undercurrent of like unease. He's very tense, shoulders are up, you know. And then I found in later conversations with him that he was extremely tense, extremely neurotic. And anyway, so it was interesting watching him talk about it, because I think, like him, a lot of men, and maybe women too, don't understand that there's an end to the processing of those emotions. Like you do it and then it's done, and you don't have to do that ever again, related to whatever the triggering event was. It may be difficult, it may take years, but there's like a light at the end of the tunnel. And I don't think, that when I said that to him, I went up and took my turn after he went up. There's just a look of complete lack of recognition, like never experienced that. And I could see it with a lot of other men in the audience too. Yeah.
I think it's just a lot of the time it's more painful than people expect.
Yeah.
And when they actually come in touch with that trauma and all of those difficult emotions, they're like, whoa, oh shit,
yeah,
I'm not touching
Put that in a box.
Put
shove
the lid back
that
on.
down, as Bill Burr always says. That's why men die of heart attacks at age 60. It's like, oh no, I don't want to be vulnerable. Shove that down.
Well, in my experience, and one of the things that I think you illustrate really well here is that people will tell you what is wrong with them. And what I take from that situation, what he was tense about was that he never did those sorts of things. So that was something that trying to push that off onto other people and tell them not to was a story that he has dealt with for so long, or the mode that he's been living in. And to see other people doing that causes kind of a dissonance in somebody, and all that tension and all that unease. It doesn't mean that they recognize it, because you still have to be willing to accept it and explore it. Mm-hmm. That's what I see from that.
Mm-hmm. And
I
in
think
terms of please Heather.
Oh, okay. I was just going to say that I think it what's interesting there too is how it ties back into the idea of the sort of linear narrative time, which gives us this false sense of control, because we have an idea that we create our own story, right? And if we create our own story, then why would we have to deal with our trauma? Because we decide that's not part of our story. We're going to fix climate change. We don't have to deal with what our body says. We control that, right? In the linear narrative. And so we can decide what we want, take steps to plan what it is, delegate tasks to people, and make it happen. And that's the beauty of the linear narrative. And then it turns out that's not how things work. And as we sort of transition back to some continuous version of how things work, then we can drop into, okay, what's actually going on right now? Like David was saying with circling, when that, and Yuvi, what you brought up about in meditation is so interesting, how there's actually micro narratives. Like this default mode network is spinning these micro narratives that kind of match the macro narratives the culture is putting on us. And that when all of that is sort of lifted up, that underneath is suddenly, I don't have control. My subconscious is spinning away, doing its own thing, and making me confabulate reasons to have an explanation for what I'm doing. But most of it's just stimulating by this stuff that's coming up. That's all probably part of my past. And so I think that's where we're headed into. And it's a scary place for people to be transitioning between, to drop the story. What happens? It's scary.
So I'm so glad you said that before I opened my mouth.
Me too.
Because one of the things I wanted to talk about was, and also more importantly, see if people were relating to my experiences when you have this so-called, when you have an awakening and you think, oh, maybe the world and the way we're going isn't anywhere near as comfortable and secure as I thought it was, and trying to process, for me personally, the mess that we are in as a human species and as a planet, and then wanting to engage with people who potentially were also having similar questions, and I would really love to hear other people's thoughts, but feeling completely very paralyzed, a bit like a deer in the headlights, going like, I don't know what to do. And I don't know if that's equatable to trauma, but it definitely feels from a corporeal and as well as mental space, just going like, oh, I feel like we're going towards a wall and I don't know what to do. Like, can anybody help me steer the train away? And it's true. Like, I wake up every day and I go, is this what I should be doing with my life and my job? And, you know, should I be taking up arms, or should I be writing pamphlets, or should I, you know, how much can I recycle my trash every single day? And it's again, I don't know if that would be trauma, but it feels from a very physical perspective like a lot of anxiety. And you know, one of the reasons I'm here listening and discussing things with you is because that's my way right now of trying to address that feeling of panic that I have when I actually think about it. So yeah.
But this brings up something awesome for me. So one of my passions is organizational dynamics, leadership in multinational organizations, and following the Industrial Revolution into the technological revolution, particularly how teams are organized and how they approach problems. And in the industrial system, you have what's called a waterfall development technique, which is you do all of your research up front, you make your plan, this is how you do it, then you spend all of this money making the machine that produces everything right the same. Very linear concept, very robust, but not versatile or adaptable. Now you have the technological age coming in where people are producing things at a much faster rate, and you have to have a new methodology to be able to produce this, because you cannot spend that much time developing a product before it becomes obsolete itself. So they've developed a new type of technology to deal with this, and that's called the agile methodology. And that is, you develop in 2-week cycles and you keep reevaluating and reiterating, and you go out there, you fail hard, you fail fast, and then you learn from it quickly. And so this is something that's developing that really very much parallels what we're experiencing as a culture too, to move from that very top-down monstrous approach to building things to being very flexible and adaptable, and moving from a different place. And one other thing that's really cool in these parallels is that from the industrial side, you have people with specific roles that do specific things, and it's a very classical mechanistic sort of perspective on things. But in an agile team, you have maybe subject matter experts. It's a very flat, everybody has their own individual proficiencies or competencies, and they all must interact together in a different way to produce this sort of collective intelligence in order to be able to process problems that they've never encountered before. So, sorry, I'm really passionate about this stuff because I love watching these problems be solved out there in society. Just wanted to let you guys know about that.
Thank you. I have some inspiration to answer the lady before about, and I'll return this question again back to the feeling of time. If the time is circular or the time moves from now or from before towards purposes into the industrial pattern model of the world. And if I have to, you mentioned several times, I don't know if it's trauma. Yeah, maybe the trauma, it's just diminishing the the reality, it's kind of, because what trauma makes, or if we call it a want, it makes an opening or spatial sensitivity for some that everybody develops towards some subjects. And what the myth or the ritual or the circling today is doing, it actually gives meaning to these individual experiences, which do not have, which we cannot resolve with our story that has some purpose in our individual future, because they somehow keep on repeating. And when we have these rituals, when we experience things together, like in the circling practices, we kind of get on bodily level the meaning that we're missing on individual level, because it's the spatial sensitivity that cannot make sense in a logical story. So it's difficult for me. It's coming to me now, so I don't have the words to make a very logical story out of this with words, with logic, but it is connected to what Vervaeke is talking about, the concept of time and how we perceive time, and the whole concept of development and achieving things. It's not that I'm judging this, but I'm really wondering what is the next level with all this sophistication that we have now as civilization. What is the next level of collective experience of here and now, as it was before the actual age, with all this development, with all these things that we know now? What is the next level of the circle experience of time?
I would like to keep talking about that. That was one of the parts of the lecture that was very interesting to me, was when he started talking about time as circular, and I really wanted to know if anyone had any insights to that. And also something that was tangentially related to what a few people were saying earlier. I think he said something along the lines of like wisdom is it wasn't so trite as like wisdom is power. It was something like, it's in the comments somewhere. Wisdom is like how to tap into power. And I think he was
Yeah, so that was the pre-axial idea, that basically in the circular view of the world and time, there was no categorical distinction between plants, animals, humans, or gods. There was just a difference in power. So, animals are more powerful than plants, humans are more powerful than animals, and gods are more powerful than humans. And then in the axial age, they became seen as somehow categorically different.
Okay.
There is an aspect of this which is really beautiful. Back in around 2000, 2005, that time frame, I had an argument with my wife ongoing about whether time was linear or cyclical, and over time the awareness is, it's more spiral. It has both natures, right? It does kind of go around and then periodically jump up, and I think part of what Vervaeke is trying to do, and looking at this is back to your, Valentina, your question of how do we get back the power of seeing that aspect of interacting with nature in a cyclical way, and the narrative part as well. How do we sort of combine the wisdom of that in a practice? And that's,
Yeah, exactly.
and that's something that it seems to be, he hasn't, even through the 38 lectures that I've seen so far, has only briefly touched on kinds of practices that reawaken this capacity. I think that he's starting to outline that. I'm curious if he's going to outline it more later on, but I do think this is much more a set of practices than it is a lecture, right? This is just the pointing out, this is why you care about this. This is why this is worth spending time on. And the more that, and it also kind of points to the landmarks of what's happening in culture in a way that will say, you'll see more and more of a need to do this, right? The kinds of things that are going haywire in your life and in politics are because we don't have these practices in place. And it really is the part of it, and I don't think he's really brought this to mind yet, is really recognizing that the ways of knowing that are possible are much broader than we think. The modern Western perspective, we're much more aware of the propositional way of knowing. But down at the root of it is the participatory way of knowing, and that is really that circle. That's really in the present moment, what's happening with me right now, and the intervening layers as well, the perspectival and the process ways of knowing, and the process or procedural ways of knowing are also. It's kind of like you were saying, Janelle, about the shift from waterfall to agile. These ways are much more intertwined, and we've left a lot of those behind, and it's time to reawaken those and bring this back into daily practice.
Yeah.
And
sorry,
Go ahead. Talk.
One of the things I think that we either forget or overlook or just aren't aware of, but let me put it this way. I think we have a tendency to try and look at space and time as separate things, when in reality they're not. They're very much interconnected. You can't have one without the other, or you can't have any sort of action in an arena without both of those things. And what ends up happening is our perspective of time has increased, as our perspective of space has increased. For example, when we realize that we rotated around the sun, then we have this cyclical, everything is just in an orbit. But then you realize that the sun is also moving in its trajectory, rotating around a galaxy. So you end up having the Earth going in a spiral form through space and time. All right, so that we're never in the same place or the same time at any given point. And of course, the galaxies are also moving and all of these things too. So these are just as our concepts of space expand, our concepts of time must also.
I wanted to comment on the point about understanding circular time. And John Vervaeke talks about shamans in the past, how they had a very good understanding of circular time. I don't know if he ever talks about woman shamans specifically, or who came to later be called witches because the church wanted to eradicate their way of knowing. But a lot of those practices for experiencing circular time actually come from them, come from women shamans, because women's experience of their bodies is a lot more tied to cycles. And it's something that in the modern age we've found ways to get rid of, through birth control and easy contraception and easy ways to deal with their periods and things like that. But before the modern era, it was a lot more obvious. And I've found that these kinds of practices of just feeling how the experience of now changes in a circular way, in a cyclical way, and how it always comes back. So, and obviously, like, observing my monthly cycle is one thing, but then also I notice how my body responds differently to the cycles of the moon, or different times of day, or observe how my body responds to breathing. When I breathe out, when I breathe in, it feels different. And just refining my capacity to feel it in a participatory way, not in thinking about it or just like, oh yeah, my body is doing this, not telling myself stories about it, but actually just the experience of being in it as it changes and comes back and changes and comes back, has been really, really useful practice for understanding circular time and also how everything is connected. Because if I'm observing my breath and then I notice different things happening around me or different thoughts pop up, all of those things affect the cycle of my breath. So it's like it's different feedback loops happening. So it's not just like my body is breathing itself and it's just like this kind of static clockwork thing. It's affected by the things in the external world. So
I think then too, like,
Go ahead.
you want to go ahead?
No, you go.
I was just going to say that then I think where we get the both and in the spiral of being able to combine the linear narrative and the cyclical is to take those skills of present moment attunement and apply them to narratives, so that instead of creating our narrative, we're listening for our narrative, so that the narrative comes to us rather than us projecting it out. Yeah, I don't know.
I can't help but think
Very
about
well said.
what my experience is with this. Like I'm not entirely sure I understand what is being talked about here with circular time, but what comes to mind is this idea of having multiple personalities below your conscious personality. And this is something I've worked on quite a lot in meditation, to be in touch with the different parts of me that are in conflict with each other or disagree. And I can easily find this because I'll change my mind about a subject, or I'll start thinking about people a lot differently depending on whether I'm hungry or any number of kind of bodily states. So in saying that, I think there's a lot of different ways that the sub-personalities can look out at the world and then be in conflict and create different types of narratives about the world. And in integrating and uncovering what those things are, those personalities are, and integrating kind of like a singular idea or direction for the whole being, it seems like time kind of coalesces into that more linear format for me anyway. And I'm just not sure if I'm misunderstanding what this is, but it seems like the way that I experience jumbled or circular time is through that awareness of multiple personalities conflicting with each other. Am I saying anything that kind of aligns with anyone's idea about this?
I think I have a way I might be able to try and explain it that might help clarify. So there's another way to think of cycles, and that's not in a circular motion. Mm-hmm. That is in a wave particle duality, where the cycle of the sine wave troughs and crests and troughs, right? Right. And everything in the universe can be thought of in this sort of mode, since energy goes in waves. And certainly if you think about our electromagnetic spectrum, for example, then you have all these different cycles going up and down for particular things, and you have lots of different types of waves interacting. And when you have waves interact, you get peaks and troughs, and they add and they subtract each other in different ways and interact in different ways. You can also hear this in music when you hear harmonies or dissonance and things like that. So you can think of it as that sort of interaction, where those repeating waves are cycles of it going up and down and not just circular. Is that helpful?
Right. Yeah, actually that makes a lot more sense. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks.
Well, I'd also say that the cycles are embedded in our daily practice as well. So the rituals that we have that we don't even recognize as rituals of habit of, I wake up in the morning, I have breakfast, and then, I have a pattern to my day. Mm-hmm. The way that I do that is a cyclical nature. And in some way, one of the things that I think is really powerful about this is the thing that I think is very powerful about the narrative frame is it helps us optimize. It kind of gives us a recipe for living life, so we don't have to figure out every day, oh my God, what do I do about food? It's like, oh no, I have a ritual for that. I have a shopping ritual to get ingredients. I have a cooking ritual to prepare. So these things kind of streamline the experience so that I can get more done and organize my life in that way. And in a way, it becomes background shortly after I get it done. And it becomes so background that we don't even recognize the cyclical nature of it anymore. It just feels like, oh, that's life. But you disrupt that stuff, and it all of a sudden becomes very apparent. I'm always, it's not so much a cyclical nature, but I'm always amazed when something like power goes out, the water goes out, the internet goes out, and I now have to change my habit of what I want to do. It's like I'll immediately think, oh, I can do this. No, I can't. Okay, I can do this. No, that's not possible either. and how much that is kind of just behind the scenes. So I think that cycles for me are much more these small scale and larger scale things that become background and allow me to process kind of unconsciously, or subconsciously, allowing those things to happen on their own. I did want to say something else too. This is really kind of interesting. I know Mike and I've talked to you before about the book from Leonard Shlain called The Alphabet versus the Goddess. And this is the idea that alphabetic language specifically was something that was a change in culture that made that disposed the goddess, the feminine god idea, and there's something in what we were talking about with feminine cycles, feminine women being more aware of their bodies, that made me think of biblical notions of women on cycles are unclean and to be separated from the men in some way. There's a body kind of a separation of that cycle, and so the reason I think this is kind of interesting, and the reason that I think it's interesting that there's a possible war between the linear narrative style of thinking versus the more embodied way of cyclical thinking, is because I'm going to say this: the linear format is very fragile. It can be disrupted very much by a body sense. The body has to be suppressed. It's almost a violent opposition to that feminine cycle because it's so powerful, in order to allow this narrative self to gain some traction. And so when men say we don't have time to process our feelings, I think that's something similar. It's like it's undoing all the work that we've done to suppress all of that stuff so that we can get stuff done. Right?
But that's my foundation. Why would I want to chip away at that?
Exactly.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to bring up too is the power that comes with recognizing your control over these sorts of cycles that you're talking about, David. When you can start to devise your life in these patterns and you set these things up, it does a couple of things. It automates a great part of your life, and it relieves a lot of decision fatigue and a lot of stress, which allows your mind to open up into thinking about new concepts and doing lots of other things that you ordinarily wouldn't have the time and effort to be able to do.
Yeah, fully agree with that. That's why we started cooking all of our meals for the week. Make less decisions is what we're always trying to do, because there's just too much coming in. Yeah. If we have to sit there and think about what do I want for dinner, or where should we go for dinner, then it's just it's like glucose being burnt. I really value that stuff.
So I think that was all very helpful. I think I still am having a little bit of trouble understanding if Vervaeke's talking about time being circular in the sense that what seemed to be we were all just talking about was that routines emerge within time, and those become circular because events are circular, like a period. Anything periodic is almost circular because it keeps coming back again in predictable intervals. But I think what Janelle was saying was there's this idea of the spiral, the sun is going this way while the earth is turning around it, so it makes a spiral. And is there some sort of relationship that if understood properly could access greater realms of power, for instance, or just utility, in understanding time as kind of a spiral cycle in which the events line up but kind of on top of each other? I'm still just not clear about what exactly John was talking about when he's speaking about time being circular versus what I think we were talking about routines being circular.
Yeah, I guess it's just an example kind of to ground it in something very simple, but so there's a couple things, a couple ways to think about it. And one thing that I want to preface this with is the map is not the territory. So whatever kind of concept we use to illustrate this, that's not it. That's just a way to illustrate it. the reality behind it is much more complex and much more amazing. So when we try to put it into a concept and it's like, oh yeah, that makes sense, then just recognizing that we are understanding the concept but not actually reality, I think is really useful. So this is why there's kind of like more simple and more complex ways that illustrate, that point at the same thing, but neither of them are actually the thing. So with that said, there's a couple ways that people have tried to illustrate it, and one is spiral dynamics. So, I mean, even in the word, is like we kind of go into in a spiral. As an individual grows, they increase in complexity, while transcending and including some of the earlier stages. In the same way, society goes through these different cycles that progress as they increase in complexity. And in the same way, perhaps the universe is doing something similar by, starting out with simple atoms, then developing stars and then planets, and then, these spiral galaxies, and then sentient life. And so that's kind of one way to formulate it, that everything is spiraling as it increases in complexity. Another way to think about this is different, because this spiraling thing still kind of sees time as linear. Like something is unfolding from the Big Bang towards whatever. But another way to see this is to see time as nonlinear. And so that's to use the metaphor of quantum physics, so the wave-particle duality. So looked from one perspective, things are separate. They are atoms, they're particles, there's like this galaxy over here, and you are a human over there. They're kind of like objects. But then when looked from another perspective, everything just exists in a state of probability. So it's not really an object, it's like a field.
Then it collapses with attention to one thing in this dimension.
Yeah. So that's another way to conceptualize, like, okay, what does it mean to have a continuous cosmos, or like to have time being nonlinear? And it's a probability field within which all of time exists, and things kind of emerge out of it when we are conscious of them, or something like that. And again, this is just a metaphor. I'm not saying that this is how it is in reality.
Right.
And maybe one way to bring that down into a concrete example, since we talked about meal planning and how awesome that makes things. As you go through that process on a weekly basis, you learn what works better and what doesn't. You learn what meals to pick. So every week, your process is a little bit more refined. You're doing the same thing over and over, but just a little bit better the next time around, or at least that's the goal, right? Because if you wouldn't be doing it better, you'd be entering into what's called a downward spiral, right? So
that's helpful. Thank you.
There's also, I want to bring to mind, there's another cognitive scientist out there named Donald Hoffman, who has a book out now called The Case Against Reality. And he's got a very interesting perspective that it's a little bit wild, in that what he says is that what we see, our senses and the world that we construct based on what we sense, is really just is a kind of a user interface, and that it's kind of like the desktop, and this example, as I'm looking at my screen on the Zoom, I know that you guys aren't here physically with me, that this is a projection that does this. But even on this device, the image is really just an interpretation of voltage signals within my computer. And if I had to deal with the local voltage signals, that wouldn't make any sense. Now, the reason that this is kind of interesting is because one of the things that falls out of his perspective, that our awareness is kind of a user interface, is that space-time itself is just a data structure. It's just a way that the user interface has to present things to us. And that different organisms, insects, ants and bees, may have a very different concept of space-time than we do. And I like this from the perspective of the movie Arrival. If anybody saw the movie Arrival, kind of the main point of that is, hey, there's a different way to incorporate language with space-time awareness that gives you a deeper sense of that. And there are people who think shamanistically that give you that kind of overview effect of space-time in a way that doesn't make it seem linear anymore. That linear causality kind of evaporates, and you start to see an interdependent connectedness in all things. And it's a very interesting. I mean, it sort of breaks our mind, but that I think is some of what we're starting to become more aware of as we're deeply connected with each other, and that we're starting to awaken this deeper collective intelligence.
Yeah, and interesting also to see the interdependent. How did you say it? Interdependent. To see that
just comes out of the mouth.
Yeah, to see that as different sets of probabilistic, like different sets of probabilities. And I think maybe John Vervaeke talks about this in one of the later lectures, or maybe it's from somewhere else, but to see beings or people or systems as kind of semi-stable sets of probabilities, and when they interact with each other, they change how the probabilities play out for each of those systems. So
right.
you know, like the likelihood that your heart is going to continue beating for the next 5 minutes is pretty high, you know. So that probability is like selecting the same thing moment to moment. But if you come face to face with a truck, then that probability field is going to get disrupted, and a different probability is going to get selected. So maybe that's not the perfect example, but something like that.
There's a better one. This is really actually kind of interesting, because also there's a book called On Intelligence by Jeff Hawkins, Hawkins, I think, that was written in 2002, 2003. One of the examples that he gives that's really interesting is recognizing, and I think that John actually talks about this as well. John Vervaeke talks about the homuncular fallacy, the idea that the way that we interpret vision is we got a little man in our mind, but wait a minute, how does he do that? And it's like, it actually doesn't occur that way. And the way that this was described for me at one point is, if I think of my eye and look at the structure of my eye and notice that each of the photoreceptors, each rod or cone, is basically a sensitive cell that looks at photon. But that one cell feeds to about 10,000 locations in the brain that are sensitized to picking that up. And each one of those 10,000 connections in the brain, each one of those synapses, is also branched out to about 10,000 photoreceptors in the eye. So there's actually this branch and tree, this root and branch structure between eye and brain that reinforces. The cycle goes back and forth in a predictive reinforcing way. The interdependent reinforcing has it such that the brain says, I think what I'm seeing is a tree, and if that's the case, then these photons should light up this way. And the photoreceptors say, oh yeah, I'm seeing this, and this, and it just kind of autocorrects. So effectively, what your eye and brain are doing is settling on a stable hallucination of what you're seeing. Based on your experience and concepts and past, what we think of the likelihood is that we're seeing is this, and when it stabilizes, we see that, and then and then it feels like that's reality. It feels stable enough that we can actually respond to that. And it's one of the things that makes that when that's disrupted, it really surprises our mind in a way that, you know, that's why optical illusions stand out to us, and why specifically the blue dress, gold dress thing was so much a viral thing instantly, is because everybody's looking at the same thing and can't agree on what they're seeing. Like it resolved into two stable modes, which is like, wait a minute, that can't be. And so there's something really powerful about that. But the same thing is true for my identity. My identity is a stable hallucination within the context of what's happening in society and in the world. So, you know, that's a way that I look at all of that. And that's the agent arena, right? The agent arena is basically that roots and branches it's funny because when I think of this, it's not just my brain that's doing the interpretation. It's also the environment that's helping with that interpretation. It's not just my eye that's doing perceiving or my brain that's doing perceiving. It's the dance between them that looks at finding that stable hallucination. What's the narrowest bridge which I can rely upon as a heuristic for what it is that I care about, what's relevant here.
Yeah. And this is where all those shamanic psychotechnologies, disruptive psychotechnologies come into play. Also, a lot of them are encompassed in various wisdom traditions, meditation traditions, for different things that you can do to disrupt that stable hallucination of how you see the world, how you see all the stories, and how you see yourself, how you perceive yourself, and recognize that all of those things are constructs. And not just like intellectually think about it, oh yeah, my sense of self is a construct, but to actually experience it. And it's such a shock to the system, which is why they talk about awakening experiences and no self and all of the stuff. Because, yeah, it's a completely different way of perceiving the world. All of a sudden, it's like, oh shit, all of that is a hallucination. And now I'm not hallucinating. And it's like, ah! And the agent arena thing is also interesting because we outsource a lot of our cognitive tasks to society and to other people. For example, when we're out on the street and something unusual happens, we look around and see how other people are responding. We don't necessarily do our own sense making. And if nobody else is reacting, we're like, must be nothing. And then this is partially why when shamans go, why shamans go into isolation to do their practices, because then they're completely removed from outsourcing their cognitive tasks to other people. And they're not, their hallucination is not reinforced by others as much. It's a lot easier to disrupt it. That's why monks go to caves. Yeah.
Oh, I think this has been a fantastic conversation, but I do have to go. So
Yeah, I think it's probably time to wrap up here, guys.
Thank you all so much.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. These are so fun.
Thanks
I
for
look
coming,
forward to these
guys.
every week.
It has been so inspiring. Thank you so much.
Cool. Same time next week?
Mike, for initiating
Great.
this.
No problem.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
Bye.
Yep, we'll see you.
See you guys.
All right, next Monday,
Bye.
same
Sure.
time.
All right. Bye-bye.
For all of you guys still
Bye.
listening in the stream, if you like this content, we've got 2 courses that we're doing about sovereignty and shadow work, which we've actually talked about quite a lot throughout this discussion. So I think it's worth checking out if you are into this content and you want to figure out how to actually have better collective intelligence, have conversations that aren't constantly being hijacked by emotions and trauma and that sort of thing. If you want to check them out, they're at courses.futurethinkers.org. And again, thank you for joining us and for participating. We're really happy to have you, and see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.